Hey, welcome back, friend. Come in, get comfortable. Maybe you're already lying down. Maybe you're curled up somewhere warm with the lights low. That's exactly where you should be. Tonight, we're not going anywhere fast. We're going to slow everything down until it feels like the middle of the night in a village that stopped existing 500 years ago, and we're going to stay there a while. Tonight's story is about bread. It's not the bread you picked up at the store this week, wrapped in plastic, sliced so evenly it looks machine-drawn. I mean bread the way it used to be, back when almost nobody had an oven of their own, and yet almost everybody ate bread every single day, sometimes 3 times a day, for their whole lives. I want to take you into the world where that happened. The world of communal ovens and pre-dawn kneading, of village bakers who knew your family's dough by the smell of it, of laws written about the weight of a loaf, and superstitions passed down about which way to cut a slice. If this is your first time here, I'm so glad you found your way to this channel. We spend our nights walking slowly through ordinary corners of history, the parts that usually get skipped over because nothing important happens in them. No battles tonight, no kings. Just people and fire and flour and the small quiet miracle of turning grain into something warm enough to hold in your hands. If that sounds like your kind of evening, consider subscribing so you can come back and drift off with us again another night. But there's no rush. Nothing else to do right now except settle in and listen. Let's step inside. Before the sun comes up, I want you to imagine a village. Not a specific one, not yet, just a shape in your mind. Low stone or timber houses clustered close together, thatched roofs sloping down toward the ground, a scatter of smoke rising here and there into a sky still mostly dark. This could be somewhere in the English countryside in the 1200s, or a small town along a river in what's now France or Germany. The details shift from place to place and century to century, but the rhythm of the morning stays remarkably the same wherever you land. It is cold, not painfully so, but the kind of cold that gets into your fingers the moment you step outside, the kind that makes your breath visible in a thin gray ribbon. The stars are still out. Somewhere a rooster hasn't even started yet. And already in one particular building near the center of the village, someone is awake. This is the Bakehouse. In most villages there was only one, sometimes attached to the manor, sometimes standing on its own near the mill or the well. And inside it, long before anyone else in the village has stirred, the baker is already moving. Picture this for a moment. A single small window, shuttered against the cold, letting in almost no light. A low door, worn smooth at the latch from thousands of hands. Inside, the air is thick, not with cold now, but with the leftover warmth of yesterday's fire still clinging to the stones, mixed with the sour, slightly tangy smell of fermenting dough. That smell is the first thing that would hit you if you walked in. It's not the clean bread smell you might expect. It's earthier than that, almost like the smell of a cellar or the inside of a barrel that once held wine. The baker, let's say his name is Osric, though of course it could be any name at all, has been awake since well before the sky started to lighten. He didn't have a clock. Nobody did. He woke because his body had learned, over years, to wake at this hour, the way farmers learn to wake with the changing light of the seasons. In winter, this might mean rising in what feels like the dead of night. In summer, it might only mean rising a little before dawn. Either way, there was no snooze button, no gentle alarm easing him into consciousness. There was only the cold floor under his feet and the work waiting for him. His first task every single morning was the fire, not lighting it from nothing. That would take too long and waste too much effort, but coaxing yesterday's embers back to life. Ovens in this world were almost always built of brick or stone, shaped like a low dome, sometimes built right into the wall of the bakehouse, sometimes standing as its own separate structure outside. And these ovens held onto their heat in a way that feels almost magical if you've never experienced it. The stone itself becomes the fire. It absorbs the heat over hours of burning and releases it slowly, long after the flames themselves have died down. So Osric's job was not so much to start a fire as to feed one that had been smoldering quietly through the night. He would kneel at the low mouth of the oven and with a practiced hand stir the ashes until he found the dull orange glow still hiding underneath. Then straw first, thin and quick to catch, followed by kindling, and only once that was crackling nicely, larger pieces of wood. I want you to think about this next part carefully, because it's one of those details that most people never learn, and it changes the way you understand medieval bread completely. The fire inside that oven was never meant to bake the bread directly. Not the way we think of an oven today, with the heat source running the whole time food cooks inside it. Instead, the fire was built up, allowed to burn hot for an hour or more, until the stone walls and floor of the oven had absorbed enormous amounts of heat. Then, and only then, the baker would rake out all the embers and ash, sweep the oven floor clean with a long-handled broom, sometimes made of wet cloth tied to a pole, and only after all of that the bread would go in. This meant an oven could hold heat steady enough to bake bread for hours after the fire itself was gone. It also meant timing mattered enormously. Too soon and the oven was too hot, and the crust would burn black before the inside had a chance to cook. Too late, and the oven had cooled too much, and the loaves would come out pale and heavy, more like warmed dough than bread. The good baker developed a kind of internal clock for this, judging the moment by the color of the stone, the way it seemed to glow, by holding a hand near the opening and counting how long he could bear the heat before pulling it back, by the sound the walls made as they cooled and contracted. Let us step inside a little further and watch what happens next, because before any of that bread can go into the oven, there is another whole world of work that happened the evening before, work that most of us never think about at all. The night before bread does not happen quickly. This is something worth sitting with for a moment, because in our own time, if we want bread, we can have it in minutes, sliced and toasted before we've even finished making coffee. But in the world we're visiting tonight, bread was the result of a process that stretched back not just hours, but sometimes days, and touched the hands of several different people before a single loaf ever reached a table. It started, in a sense, with the grain itself, months earlier, out in the fields. But let's not go quite that far back tonight. Let's start instead with the evening before baking day, in a kitchen or a bakehouse where the dough itself was coming to life. I want you to imagine a wooden trough, long and shallow, worn smooth on the inside from years of hands working within it. This was the kneading trough, sometimes called a mea in parts of France, and it sat like a piece of furniture in the corner of the bakehouse, almost like a small boat turned upside down, except open on top. Into this trough went the flour, sifted through cloth or a coarse sieve to remove the largest bits of bran and grit, though never removed entirely. Medieval flour was never as pure white and fine as what we buy today. It carried texture and little flecks of darker bran, and depending on the season and the harvest, sometimes a faint grittiness from the millstone itself. Now here is something that might surprise you. There was no such thing as a small packet of yeast that you could simply stir into warm water. Yeast, as a living organism, was not understood the way we understand it today. Nobody knew about the tiny organisms doing the work. What they knew through long observation passed down from grandmother to daughter, from master baker to apprentice, was that if you kept a piece of old dough from the last batch, wrapped it in cloth, kept it in a slightly warm and slightly damp spot, it would still be alive in its own way days or even weeks later. This was called the leaven, or sometimes the starter, and it functioned almost exactly like what we now call a sourdough culture. Picture this for a moment. A woman, let's imagine her name is Alice, sitting near the low fire in her own home the evening before baking day, working this old piece of dough into the new batch. She doesn't know why it works. She only knows that it does because her mother showed her and her mother's mother before that. She breaks the old, slightly sour-smelling lump into pieces, works it through the new flour with water, sometimes a little warm ale for extra richness, and begins to knead. Kneading in this world was not a delicate task. This was full body work, done standing, leaning into the trough with the whole weight of the body, again and again, for what might be 20 minutes or longer, until the arms ached and the dough itself began to change under the hands, from something rough and shaggy into something smoother, more elastic, more alive. And I do mean alive in its own quiet way. Somewhere in that trough, invisible to anyone watching, wild yeast and bacteria were waking up, beginning to feed on the sugars in the flour, beginning to breathe out tiny bubbles of gas that would, over the coming hours, make the dough rise. Nobody in that kitchen could have explained this in scientific terms, but they trusted it, the way you trust the sun to come up, because it had always happened before, and it would happen again tonight. Once the kneading was done, the dough was left to rise, covered with a cloth, set in the warmest corner of the room, often near the hearth, sometimes even tucked partially under blankets in colder months to keep the chill from slowing it down too much. And here the household would simply wait. There was no way to hurry this along. The rising happened at its own pace, sometimes overnight, sometimes even longer, depending on the temperature of the room and the strength of the leaven. I want you to sit with that for a moment. An entire household planning its whole next day around the mysterious, invisible activity happening quietly in a wooden trough by the fire. No one could see it working. No one could speed it up. All they could do was trust the process and go to sleep, Doesn't that feel like a different kind of patience than we practice today? We live now in a world of instant answers, instant food, instant everything. But there was a rhythm to life back then that simply could not be rushed, and people built their entire days, their entire understanding of time itself, around waiting for things like dough to rise, and fires to catch, and seasons to turn. Let us step forward now into the very early morning when that overnight waiting finally comes to an end. Carrying the dough through the streets in many medieval villages and towns, most households did not own an oven at all. Ovens were expensive to build and dangerous if not built carefully, given how much fire they required and how many houses were built of wood and thatch, all crowded close together. Because of this, ovens were often owned communally, sometimes by the lord of the manor, sometimes by the town itself, and every household in the area was expected to bring their dough there to be baked, often for a fee or a portion of the loaf itself. This detail changes the whole picture of a medieval morning because it means the streets themselves became part of the bread-making process. I want you to imagine, just after first light, doors opening all across the village, one after another. Alice from the story before wrapping her risen dough in a cloth, setting it into a shallow wooden bowl or basket, and carrying it out into the cold morning air toward the bakehouse. She would not be alone. All along the narrow lane, other doors were opening too. Neighbors stepping out with their own bundles of dough, some balanced on their heads in the fashion common in many regions, others carried at the hip in baskets, still others pushed along in small handcarts if the household had a particularly large batch to bring. Children too young to be much help otherwise were often sent along simply to hold a place in line or to carry something small. Picture the sound of this. Wooden shoes, or in poorer households, simple leather-soled boots clattering against packed dirt or cobblestone. Low voices exchanging morning greetings, the kind of half-awake conversation neighbors share when they've known each other their whole lives and don't need many words to communicate. Somewhere a dog barks at the commotion. Somewhere else a rooster, later than it should have been, finally announces the morning properly. And underneath all of this, the smell. Not yet the smell of baking bread, that comes later, but the yeasty, faintly sour smell of dozens of households' worth of dough, all traveling together through the same cold morning air toward the same waiting oven. At the bakehouse itself, a kind of quiet, orderly chaos would build. Osric, our baker, already busy managing his fire, would now also need to manage the arrival of dozens of loaves belonging to dozens of different families, each one needing to go into the same oven, one after another, and each one needing to come back out to the correct household afterward. How did they keep track of whose bread was whose? This is one of my favorite small details, because the solutions people came up with were wonderfully practical. In many villages, each household had its own mark, a particular shape or symbol pressed into the top of the dough with a wooden stamp, or scored into the surface with a few careful cuts of a knife. Some families used initials, others used simple pictures, a cross, a star, a small circle with lines through it. This mark served two purposes at once. It let the baker sort the loaves correctly once they came out of the oven, and it also became a kind of household signature, something recognizable across generations, almost like a family crest, except made of flour and water instead of paint and cloth. I want you to imagine Osric now, standing at the long wooden table just outside the oven's mouth, receiving loaf after loaf, checking each mark, calling out names as he set them onto his long-handled wooden peel, a flat paddle used to slide the loaves deep into the oven's belly without anyone needing to reach in themselves. One after another, dozens of loaves, each one shaped slightly differently depending on the household that made it, some round, some oblong, some scored across the top in decorative patterns that also happened to help the bread expand evenly as it baked, without cracking unpredictably. And once the oven was full, the door, often a simple wooden slab or a metal plate in wealthier establishments, would be sealed shut, and the waiting would begin all over again. It's only this time everyone in the village was waiting together. I wonder if you've ever experienced anything quite like that. A whole community, pausing at roughly the same moment each morning, all waiting on the same fire, the same heat, the same slow chemistry happening inside the same stone walls. There's something almost beautiful in that, isn't there? A kind of shared patience built right into the structure of daily life. Let's rest here a moment and then continue on into the oven itself and what was actually happening to that dough as the heat took hold. What heat does to grain while the bread bakes, and we have some time now, since a good loaf might need close to an hour or more in a properly heated communal oven. I want to slow down even further and talk about what was actually happening inside those loaves. Not in the scientific language we might use today, but in the way it might have looked and felt to someone standing nearby, watching, waiting, half dozing against the warm outer wall of the bakehouse. The dough, once placed on the hot stone floor of the oven, begins almost immediately to change. The outer surface, exposed directly to that intense stored heat, starts to dry and firm within the first few minutes, beginning the slow process of forming a crust. Underneath that surface, though, something more dramatic is happening. The gas bubbles that had been quietly forming overnight, trapped throughout the dough by that long, patient rise, begin to expand rapidly as the heat reaches them. This is what causes the dough to spring upward in those first minutes in the oven, sometimes visibly. A loaf that looked modest going in might rise noticeably before the crust sets firm enough to hold its final shape. Bakers in this world understood this instinctively, even without the scientific vocabulary we'd use now. They knew that scoring the top of a loaf, cutting a few careful slashes before it went into the oven, gave that expanding gas somewhere controlled to escape, rather than letting the loaf crack open wherever it pleased. This is why so many of those household marks doubled as functional scoring. A decorative cross on top of a loaf wasn't just pretty, it was also quietly doing the job of controlling how the bread would rise. As the minutes pass, the heat works its way deeper into the loaf, and here is where the real transformation happens, the one that turns a heavy, sticky mass of flour and water into something you could tear apart with your hands and actually eat. The starches inside the wheat under that heat begin to absorb the remaining moisture in the dough and swell, firming up the crumb, the inside texture, from something wet and formless into something structured, something with the springy, slightly chewy quality we associate with good bread. And the crust, meanwhile, exposed to the most intense heat, undergoes its own transformation, deepening in color, developing that faintly bitter, deeply savory flavor that comes from sugars and proteins reacting together under high heat. This is the same basic chemistry, by the way, that gives a seared piece of meat its flavor, or toast its particular smell. Nobody baking bread in a medieval village could have explained any of this in those terms, but they could smell it happening, and they knew, from long experience, exactly what that smell meant, and roughly how much longer the bread had left. I want you to imagine standing near that oven now, in the mid-morning light, the village slowly waking up around you, and letting that smell reach you for the first time. Not the smell of raw dough anymore, sour and yeasty, but something entirely different now, warm, toasted, faintly sweet, mixed with wood smoke still clinging to the stone. If you've ever walked past a bakery early in the morning in our own time and felt your whole body relax a little at the smell, you already know something of what these villagers felt too, standing outside a bakehouse 800 years ago. Some comforts, it seems, don't change much across the centuries. Let's pause here again, gently, and let that image settle, before we move on to what happened once the bread finally came out. The loaves come home. There is a particular kind of relief that comes with the moment bread finally emerges from the oven, and I don't think it has changed very much across the centuries, even if almost everything else about the process has. Picture Osric now, using that same long-handled peel to reach deep into the oven and draw the loaves back out, one by one, each one transformed from the pale, soft shape that went in hours earlier into something darker, firmer, with a crust that crackled faintly as it cooled in the open air. He would set them along the long wooden table, sorting them again by their marks, calling out names or gesturing to the waiting families who had by now mostly returned, having gone home in the meantime to tend animals, fetch water, mind smaller children, or simply warm themselves by their own hearths while the baking finished. I want you to imagine Ali's returning now, walking back through streets that smell, this time unmistakably of fresh bread, streets that would have carried that smell for the rest of the morning, drifting between houses, curling up alleyways, settling into clothing and hair the way wood smoke does. She collects her own loaves, feels the warmth still radiating through the cloth she wraps them in, and heads home, this time with something to show for the long, patient process that began the evening before. At home, that bread would not simply be sliced and eaten right away, not entirely. In most medieval households, bread was baked in a large enough quantity to last several days, sometimes even longer, because the process of dough making and communal baking was involved enough that households didn't want to repeat it daily if they could avoid it. This meant fresh bread, eaten warm on baking day, was something of a small luxury, enjoyed perhaps with a bit more butter or dripping than usual, while the rest of the loaves were set aside, wrapped in cloth, stored in a dry corner of the house, to be eaten gradually over the coming days as the bread slowly firmed and dried. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes the whole texture, quite literally, of what medieval bread eating actually looked like day to day. The soft, warm loaf enjoyed on baking day was the exception, not the rule. Most of the bread most people ate most days was already a few days old, firmer, denser, sometimes requiring a bit of softening in broth or ale before it could be eaten comfortably, especially by the very young or the very old, whose teeth might not have been up to tearing through a firm crust. And this, in turn, gave rise to one of my favorite quiet details of medieval domestic life. Bread that had gone properly stale, too hard to eat comfortably on its own, was rarely thrown away. Waste, in a world where every part of the harvest represented real labor and real risk, was simply not something most households could afford. Instead, old bread became the foundation of other dishes entirely. Soaked in broth, it became the base of thick, warming soups called sops, still eaten in various forms across Europe today, from French soup à l'oignon with its bread soaked beneath melted cheese, to English bread puddings that turned old crusts into something sweet and comforting. Even the crumbs, the small leftover bits too small to save any other way, often found their way into other dishes, used to thicken sauces, bind stuffing for meat, or add texture to simple puddings. Nothing in this world was wasted, not because people were especially virtuous, but because scarcity taught practical lessons that simply became part of ordinary life, passed down without much thought, the way we might load a dishwasher a certain way without remembering exactly who first showed us how. I wonder, lying there listening to this, whether you've ever thought about your own leftover bread this way. A heel of a loaf, a few days old, softened in warm milk or broth rather than thrown away. There's something quietly comforting in that continuity, isn't there? A thread connecting your own kitchen tonight to kitchens 8 centuries gone. Let's rest a moment here, and then when you're ready, we'll step outside the individual household and into something larger, the world of laws and measurements that grew up around this daily bread, because it turns out bread was far too important to be left entirely to chance. The weight of a loaf. I want to shift our attention now, gently, away from any single household, and out into the wider world of the town and its authorities, because bread in the medieval period was not simply a private, domestic matter. It was in many ways one of the most closely regulated goods in the entire economy, and understanding why takes us into a part of history that most people never think to ask about. Consider this for a moment. Bread was, for the vast majority of medieval people, the single largest source of daily calories. Historians estimate that bread alone could account for well over half, sometimes as much as 70%, of an ordinary person's daily food intake, particularly among the poor. This was not a minor food item, a side dish, something eaten alongside a meal. It was, for most people most days, the meal itself, sometimes accompanied by a bit of cheese, an onion, perhaps some thin ale to wash it down, but bread carried the weight, quite literally, of keeping a population fed. Given that, it should come as no surprise that authorities, whether a local lord, a town council, or eventually entire kingdoms, took a very close interest in making sure bread was fairly made, fairly priced, and fairly weighed. If a baker could quietly shrink each loaf just slightly, using less flour than expected while charging the same price, that small dishonesty, multiplied across an entire town, across an entire year, represented a serious theft from the people who depended on that bread most. This led to the creation of some of the earliest and most detailed consumer protection laws in European history, laws specifically governing the size, weight, and price of bread. In England, this system became formalized under what was known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, a set of regulations that first appeared in written form in the 13th century, though similar customs likely existed informally long before that. I want you to imagine what this actually meant in practice, in the daily life of someone like Osric. Local officials, sometimes called searchers or ale conners depending on the town and the century, would periodically visit bakehouses unannounced, carrying with them a set of standard weights. They would select a loaf, seemingly at random, from the day's baking and weigh it against these standards. If the loaf came up short, even by a small amount, the baker faced real consequences, and these consequences were not gentle. Historical records from various English towns describe punishments ranging from significant fines to the pillory, a device that held the offending baker's head and hands in place in a public square, exposed to whatever ridicule or refuse the townsfolk cared to throw, to, in the most severe or repeated cases, banishment from practicing the trade altogether. Bread fraud was taken seriously precisely because bread itself was taken seriously. Interestingly, the price of a loaf could not simply be raised whenever a baker felt like it either. Because grain prices fluctuated with the harvest, sometimes dramatically from one year to the next depending on weather, disease, or war disrupting agricultural regions, the assize system instead adjusted the weight of a standard loaf up or down while keeping its price fixed. In a good harvest year, when grain was cheap and plentiful, a farthing might buy a large, heavy loaf. In a lean year, following poor weather or a failed harvest, that same farthing might only buy a noticeably smaller loaf, the weight quietly shrinking in step with the town's fortunes, while the price stayed the same, familiar and predictable for ordinary people trying to manage their household budgets. I find something quietly moving in this system, honestly. In a world without insurance, without price controls in the modern sense, without any of the economic tools we take for granted today, medieval towns built a remarkably thoughtful solution to a very real problem, one that protected ordinary people from being quietly cheated during hard times, while still allowing the system to bend and flex with the realities of harvest and weather. And this, in turn, gave rise to another detail you may have heard before without knowing its origin. The tradition of a baker's dozen, 13 items given for the price of 12, is widely believed to trace back to exactly this system of harsh penalties for underweight loaves. Bakers, understandably nervous about the consequences of coming up even slightly short on a scale they couldn't perfectly control every single time, given natural variations in dough, in oven heat, in the simple imprecision of hand shaping each loaf, began adding an extra loaf or roll to each dozen sold, as a kind of insurance against being caught short. Better to give away one extra loaf freely and safely than risk the pillory over a small miscalculation. Isn't that a wonderful little piece of history hiding inside a phrase we still use today, almost without thinking about where it came from? A 13th loaf, born not out of generosity exactly, but out of very reasonable fear, quietly folded into common language across the centuries since. Let's rest here again for a moment, letting these details settle, before we widen our view even further, and look at how bread itself varied enormously depending on where you happened to live, and how much money your household had. A loaf depends on who you are. I want to slow down even further now and talk about something that shaped the entire experience of eating bread in this period more than almost anything else. Not the baking itself, not the ovens or the fires, but a simple, quiet fact that ran underneath all of it. What kind of bread you ate depended almost entirely on who you were. Picture, for a moment, two tables, not side by side, not even in the same town necessarily, but existing at the same historical moment, perhaps only a few miles apart. At one table sits a family of free peasants, tenant farmers working land that belongs to a lord, paying their rent in labor or in a share of the harvest. At the other sits that same lord in his own hall at his own table, with servants nearby. The bread in front of each of these tables would look, feel, smell, and taste almost nothing alike, and yet both would be called simply bread. Let's begin with the peasant table, because this represents, by a wide margin, the daily experience of most people living through this period. The bread here was almost never made from pure wheat. Wheat was a demanding crop, requiring good soil, careful management, and a longer growing season than many regions could reliably provide. And what wheat a peasant household did manage to grow or acquire was often the most valuable thing they owned, frequently sold or paid as rent rather than eaten at home. Instead, the daily bread of ordinary people was far more likely to be made from rye, barley, oats, or often a mixture of grains together, sometimes called maslin, a blend of wheat and rye grown and milled together, precisely because it hedged against the risk of any single crop failing in a given year. This bread was darker, denser, and coarser than what we typically imagine when we picture bread today. Rye in particular produces a heavier, stickier dough than wheat, with less of the elastic structure that wheat's proteins provide, meaning rye loaves tended to be flatter, denser, and to keep far longer without spoiling, an advantage that mattered enormously in a world without refrigeration. I want you to imagine biting into this bread. It would not have the light, airy quality we associate with a good baguette or a soft dinner roll. It would be dense enough to feel substantial in the hand, faintly sour from the wild fermentation of the leaven, sometimes gritty from bits of bran or even small fragments of the millstone itself, that hadn't been fully sifted out. This was not bread meant to be delicate. It was meant to fill a working body through a long day of physical labor, and it did that job admirably, providing steady, slow-burning energy that would carry a farmer through hours in the field. Now let's walk over to that other table, the Lord's table, and see what waits there instead. Here, the bread would be made from the finest wheat flour available, sifted repeatedly through fine cloth to remove as much bran and husk as possible, producing a flour far whiter and finer than anything a peasant household would typically see. This bread, often called manchet in England or pain de main in French-speaking regions, both names deriving from words related to fine or refined, rose lighter, baked softer, and carried none of the coarse grittiness of peasant bread. It was, quite literally, a status symbol you could eat. The color alone told a story. Whiteness in bread in this period signaled wealth and refinement in a way that has almost completely reversed in our own time, where we often associate whole grain, darker breads with health and privilege, and white bread with something more ordinary. In the medieval world, the opposite was true. White bread required more processing, more sifting, more waste in the milling process, since so much of the outer husk of the grain was discarded to achieve that pale color, and waste in this economy was itself a luxury only the wealthy could afford. I find this reversal genuinely fascinating to sit with. The very same wheat kernel, depending on how thoroughly it was sifted, could become either a symbol of poverty and simple sustenance, or a symbol of wealth and refinement, and which one it became said everything about the household serving it, and almost nothing about the wheat itself. Between these two extremes existed a whole spectrum of bread, corresponding to the whole spectrum of medieval society. Merchants and craftsmen in towns might enjoy a bread somewhere in the middle, made from wheat but less finely sifted than the Lord's manchet, sometimes called cheat bread or wheaten bread in various regions. Servants within a wealthy household often ate a bread one step down from what their employers enjoyed, still wheat-based but coarser, sometimes literally made from the bran and lower-grade flour left over after the finest flour had been sifted out for the family upstairs. And this created an entire social vocabulary built around bread that most of us have completely lost today. A person's status could be read, quite literally, in the color and texture of the loaf in front of them, and everyone at the table would have understood exactly what that loaf communicated, without a word needing to be said. I want you to imagine sitting at one of these medieval tables now, and think about what it might have felt like to watch bread arrive, and know instantly, from its color alone, roughly where you stood in the world. There's something both fascinating and quietly sobering in that thought, isn't there? A whole hierarchy of human worth folded into something as simple as a loaf of bread. Let's rest here a moment and then travel somewhere different entirely, away from the manor house and the peasant cottage both, and into a place where bread making took on an entirely different rhythm and purpose. The monastery. Bred behind monastery walls, I want to take you somewhere quieter now, somewhere with its own particular rhythm, distinct from both the village bakehouse and the Lord's kitchen. Monasteries, scattered across medieval Europe in their thousands, developed some of the most sophisticated and consistent bread-making traditions of the entire period, and for reasons that go beyond simple hunger. Picture a monastery kitchen attached to a larger complex of stone buildings, cloisters, and gardens, often somewhat removed from the nearest town, self-sufficient by design and by philosophy. Monks and nuns, following the rules of their particular order, whether Benedictine, Cistercian, or another, structured their entire day around a fixed schedule of prayer, work, and rest, known as the horarium, and bread-making fit neatly, deliberately, into this larger rhythm. Many monasteries operated their own mills and their own bakehouses, entirely separate from any communal oven serving the surrounding village, because self-sufficiency was central to monastic life, a practical necessity as much as a spiritual value. This meant monasteries often developed remarkably consistent, well-documented baking practices, partly because monks, many of whom could read and write in a period when literacy was rare, sometimes recorded their methods, their grain allotments, their baking schedules in surviving manuscripts that historians still study today. I want you to imagine one particular monk assigned to the role of baker for his community, a position that carried real responsibility, since feeding dozens, sometimes hundreds, of fellow monks or nuns depended on his skill and consistency. His day would have followed the same basic pattern we saw with Osric, waking before dawn, tending the fire, managing the rise of the dough, but layered underneath a stricter, more regimented daily schedule of prayer bells calling the entire community to worship at set hours throughout the day and night. This meant the monastery baker had to time his work not just around the physical demands of dough and fire, but around the ringing of bells calling him and everyone else to prayer. Matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, and several more services scattered through the day, each one a fixed point around which all other work, including baking, needed to bend. Monastic bread also carried a particular symbolic weight beyond simple nutrition. Bread appears throughout Christian scripture and ritual in ways that gave it deep spiritual significance in this period, most obviously in the practice of communion, where bread, blessed and consecrated, became central to the most important ritual in Christian worship. This didn't mean the daily bread eaten in the refectory, the communal dining hall, was treated as sacred in quite the same way, but it did mean bread as a category of food carried associations of humility, sustenance, and spiritual nourishment that shaped how monastic communities thought and wrote about it. Interestingly, monastic rules often specified exact bread rations for each member of the community, a detail we know from surviving texts. The Rule of Saint Benedict, one of the most influential monastic guides of the entire medieval period, written in the 6th century and followed by countless monasteries for 1,000 years afterward, specifically addresses food portions, including bread, instructing that each monk should receive enough to sustain himself without excess, reflecting the broader monastic values of moderation and humility. I want you to imagine the quiet consistency of this life, day after day, year after year, the same bells, the same prayers, the same careful portions of bread measured out to sustain a community devoted to something larger than simple survival. There's a particular kind of peace in that repetition. Isn't there the same peace, perhaps, that you might be feeling right now, listening to this story unfold slowly, without hurry, in the quiet of your own evening? Monasteries also played another quiet but significant role in the history of bread, one that often goes unmentioned. Because monks were frequently literate, and because monastic libraries preserved and copied texts across the centuries when literacy elsewhere was scarce, agricultural knowledge, including techniques for grain cultivation, milling, and baking, was sometimes preserved and passed down through monastic records in ways that might otherwise have been lost to time, existing only in the fragile, unwritten memory of individual families and villages. Some historians also credit monasteries with preserving and refining certain baking techniques during periods of instability, when the surrounding countryside might be disrupted by conflict, poor harvests, or political upheaval, while the more insulated, self-sufficient life of a monastery continued its steady rhythm largely undisturbed. Let's rest here a moment in the quiet of that monastery kitchen before we step back out into the busier, noisier world of the medieval town, where bread took on yet another set of meanings entirely, tied not to spiritual practice this time, but to trade, commerce, and the particular characters who filled a town's marketplace. The marketplace and the bread sellers. Let's leave the quiet of the monastery behind now, gently, and step into somewhere louder, busier, more chaotic in the best sense of that word. The marketplace of a medieval town on market day, when bread stopped being simply a household matter and became something bought and sold, haggled over, displayed and inspected by strangers rather than simply carried home by the family who made it. I want you to imagine arriving at this market in the middle of the morning, once the initial rush of the earliest hours has settled into a steadier rhythm. The square itself would be crowded, stalls set up along its edges and sometimes spilling into the surrounding streets, awnings of rough cloth stretched overhead to protect goods from sun or rain, the whole space filled with noise, voices calling out prices, the creak of cart wheels on cobblestone, somewhere a dog barking, somewhere else a child laughing or crying, the particular layered soundscape of human commerce that hasn't really changed all that much across the centuries, even if the goods themselves have. Among the stalls, bread sellers occupied a particular recognized place, sometimes actual professional bakers selling their own goods directly, sometimes hucksters, a term used in various regions for independent sellers, often women, who bought bread wholesale from local bakers and resold it in smaller quantities around town, making their living on the margin between wholesale and retail price. This detail matters because it reveals something important about medieval urban economies that often gets overlooked. Women played a substantial, visible role in the bread trade, not simply as household bakers feeding their own families, but as independent economic actors, buying and reselling bread, sometimes even running their own bakehouses as widows inheriting a husband's trade, a role that historical records from various English and continental towns confirm was both common and, within certain limits, legally recognized. I want you to imagine one of these bread sellers now. Let's call her Marjorie, setting up her modest stall in the corner of the square each market day, her bread arranged carefully on a clean cloth, perhaps under a light canopy if the weather threatened rain. She would have her own regular customers, familiar faces who returned to her stall specifically, trusting her bread over a stranger's, the way we might return to a particular vendor at a farmer's market today, drawn by familiarity and trust built over repeated small transactions. Bread sold in the marketplace, unlike bread baked at home for a single family's own use, was subject to that same assize regulation we discussed earlier, and market inspectors, sometimes called searchers of bread, moved through these stalls checking weights, checking prices, occasionally confiscating loaves that failed to meet the required standard, sometimes distributing the confiscated bread to the poor or to prisoners as a kind of practical, immediate punishment that also served the community rather than simply wasting the offending loaf. I find something quite satisfying in that detail. Honestly, the idea that even punishment, in this economy of scarcity, needed to serve some useful purpose rather than simply being wasteful for its own sake. Beyond simple loaves, medieval marketplaces also offered a surprising variety of bread-based goods that might feel unexpectedly familiar to modern ears. Simple flatbreads cooked quickly on a hot stone or griddle rather than requiring a full oven were common among poorer households or travelers who needed something fast and portable. Sweetened breads, enriched with a bit of honey, dried fruit, or spices when available and affordable, appeared on special occasions, holidays, weddings, the medieval ancestors of what we might now think of as celebration cakes or festive breads. There were also bread-based dishes sold ready to eat, a kind of medieval fast food if you'll forgive the slightly playful comparison, pastries filled with meat or vegetables, sold hot from a vendor's stall to hungry workers or travelers passing through without time to prepare a proper meal themselves. Pies and pasties, their crusts sometimes eaten along with the filling, sometimes discarded afterward depending on the quality of the flour used and the wealth of whoever was eating, functioned almost like an edible container centuries before we invented paper wrapping or plastic packaging. I want you to imagine walking through this market now, the smell of these various breads and pastries mixing together in the open air, warm crusts, occasional whiffs of spice from a wealthier stall, the everyday bustle of a town going about its business on an ordinary morning, centuries ago, and yet somehow in its rhythms, its small transactions, its familiar faces returning to trusted vendors, not so entirely different from a farmer's market you might visit yourself on a Saturday morning today. Let's rest here a while longer, letting that marketplace fade quietly into the background before we turn to something a little heavier, though I promise we'll handle it gently. The years when bread itself became scarce and what people did when the grain simply wasn't there. When the grain ran short, I want to handle this next part gently, the way we handle anything heavy in these stories, because it's an important piece of the picture, even if it isn't a comfortable one. Bread, as we've spent all this time discussing, sat at the very center of medieval life. And that meant when grain harvests failed, for whatever reason, poor weather, disease affecting the crop, war disrupting planting and harvesting alike, the consequences rippled through an entire society in ways that touched almost everyone. Medieval Europe experienced periodic famines throughout its history, some localized to a single region or a single bad harvest, others far more widespread and devastating. The Great Famine of the early 1300s, affecting much of northern Europe across several consecutive years of unusually cold, wet weather that ruined harvest after harvest, stands as one of the most significant examples, and it offers a window into what happened when the ordinary rhythm of bread making we've been following all evening simply broke down. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it might have felt like in a village like the one we started this journey in, when the harvest that should have filled the granary through the winter instead came in thin, damaged by rain that never seemed to stop, or grain that rotted in the field before it could even be gathered. The bakehouse fire might still be lit each morning, the same rhythm of rising before dawn, tending the coals, but there simply wasn't enough flour to fill it the way there had been the year before. In these lean times, people turned to substitutes, ingredients that could stretch a limited grain supply or replace it entirely when there was no grain at all. This is one of those details that most history books skip over entirely, and yet it tells us so much about human resourcefulness under real pressure. Bread made during famine years might include ground acorns, carefully processed to remove the bitter tannins that make raw acorns unpleasant to eat, a labor-intensive process involving repeated soaking and boiling, but one that could turn an otherwise wasted forest resource into something edible. Bark bread made from the soft inner layer of certain trees, particularly pine or elm, ground into a coarse flour and mixed with whatever small amount of actual grain might still be available, appears in historical records from especially difficult famine years in Scandinavia and other parts of northern Europe. This bread would have been dense, unpleasant compared to ordinary bread, offering little of the nutrition that wheat or rye could provide, but it filled the stomach, and in the truest sense of the phrase, kept people alive through the worst of the crisis. Other substitutes included ground peas, beans, or whatever other starchy plant material a household could gather, mixed with the smallest possible amount of true grain flour to hold everything together. Even straw in the most desperate accounts appears mentioned as an addition to stretch what little flour remained, though bread made this way would have offered almost no real nutrition, simply providing bulk and the psychological comfort of something resembling the bread people were used to. I want you to sit with this for a moment and think about what it reveals about how central bread was, not just nutritionally but psychologically, to medieval identity and daily life. Even when true bread became impossible to make, people still reached for bread as a category, a shape, a familiar ritual, even when the ingredients inside it had become almost unrecognizable compared to ordinary times. There's something deeply human in that, isn't there, holding onto the form and comfort of a familiar thing, even when circumstances have hollowed out its substance. Famine years also brought renewed, sometimes desperate attention to the assize regulations we discussed earlier, because as grain prices spiked during shortages, the temptation for unscrupulous bakers or grain merchants to hoard supplies, or to further stretch flour with cheaper, less nutritious fillers without disclosing it, became correspondingly stronger. Historical records from famine periods show authorities issuing repeated proclamations against hoarding, against adulterating flour, sometimes threatening especially severe punishment precisely because the stakes, in these moments, were quite literally life and death for the poorest members of a community. It's worth remembering, too, that famine did not affect all levels of society equally, a hard truth that runs through much of this history. Wealthy households with greater reserves, greater ability to import grain from unaffected regions, and simply more resources to draw upon, weathered these crises far better than the poor, who often bore the overwhelming brunt of suffering during these periods. The gap between the manchet bread of the Lord's table and the peasant's dark, mixed grain loaf, which we discussed earlier as simply a matter of status in ordinary times, became, during famine, a genuine matter of survival. I don't want to dwell too long in this heavier chapter of the story, because that's not really what tonight is about, but I think it's worth including, gently, because it deepens our appreciation for everything we've discussed so far. The patient, everyday rhythm of rising dough and glowing ovens that we've spent this evening exploring existed within a world that could, without much warning, tip suddenly into genuine scarcity, and the people living through it carried that quiet awareness with them, even during the good years, shaping how they stored grain, how they measured out flour, how carefully they guarded against waste in even the most ordinary of times. Let's step back now, gently, into calmer waters and return to something more purely fascinating rather than difficult: the mill itself and the remarkable journey grain took before it ever reached a baker's trough at all. From field to flour, I want to take you backward in time now, in a sense, further back than the bakehouse, further back even than the kneading trough, to the very beginning of bread's long journey, out in the fields where the grain itself grew, and then into the mill, where it was transformed from something you couldn't easily eat at all into the flour that made everything else in tonight's story possible. Picture, if you will, a field of wheat or rye in late summer, the stalks grown tall and turned that particular golden color that signals ripeness, swaying gently whenever a breeze moves through. Harvest, in this world, was one of the most labor-intensive and important periods of the entire agricultural year, requiring nearly the whole community to participate, working together with scythes and sickles to cut the grain before weather or pests could damage it. Once harvested, the grain still needed considerable processing before it could become flour. The stalks would be gathered into bundles called sheaves, and later brought to a barn or open thrashing floor, where the grain kernels needed to be separated from the straw and husks surrounding them, a process called thrashing. This was often done by hand, using a tool called a flail, essentially two sticks joined by a short chain or leather strap, swung rhythmically to beat the grain loose from the stalks. I want you to imagine the sound of this, a whole barn full of workers swinging flails in a steady, coordinated rhythm, a percussive, almost musical sound that would have echoed across the countryside during harvest season, one of the distinctive soundscapes of the medieval agricultural year, alongside birdsong and the calls of livestock. Once threshed, the grain still needed winnowing, a process of separating the heavier grain kernels from the lighter chaff and husk material surrounding them, traditionally done by tossing the mixture into the air on a windy day, allowing the wind to carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down onto a waiting cloth or floor. This is one of those tasks that depended entirely on the weather cooperating, and you can imagine the mild frustration of a farmer waiting several days for a proper breeze, grain sitting ready but unfinished, watching the sky for any sign of useful wind. Only after all of this, thrashing and winnowing both complete, was the grain finally ready to become flour. And this required the mill, one of the most important pieces of shared community infrastructure in the entire medieval landscape. I want you to imagine approaching a mill now, most commonly a watermill in this period, built alongside a river or stream strong enough to turn its great wheel, though windmills became increasingly common in certain regions, particularly flatter areas without reliable rivers, from around the 12th century onward. The sound of a working mill was distinctive and constant, the steady rush of water turning the great wheel outside, and inside, the deeper, grinding rumble of massive stone wheels, called millstones, turning against each other. These millstones, often quarried from specific types of stone known for their durability and the particular texture they gave the grinding surface, sat one atop the other, the lower stone fixed in place, the upper stone turning above it, powered by the mechanism connected to the water wheel outside. Grain, fed into a hole at the center of the upper stone, would work its way outward between the two grinding surfaces as the upper stone turned, emerging at the outer edge already transformed into flour, still warm from the friction of the grinding process. The miller, much like the baker, occupied a particular and sometimes contentious social position within his community. Mills were often owned by the local lord, who required tenants to bring their grain specifically to his mill rather than grinding it themselves at home, charging a fee, often a portion of the flour itself, called multure, for the service. This arrangement, sometimes called mill soak or manorial monopoly depending on the region, gave millers a certain degree of local power, and also, in the popular imagination and in a fair number of surviving complaints and legal disputes, a certain reputation for dishonesty, skimming a bit more flour off the top than the agreed fee technically allowed. Medieval literature and folklore are full of jokes and complaints about dishonest millers, characters who appear across various tales and songs from the period as figures worth watching closely, their thumbs supposedly heavier than they should be when weighing out a customer's return flour. Whether this reputation was always deserved or partly just the natural suspicion that arises whenever one person controls access to something everyone else needs, it tells us something interesting about the social tensions woven into even this most basic part of the bread-making process. I want you to imagine, once the grinding was finally complete, the flour being carried home in sacks, still carrying a faint warmth and a particular smell, earthy and slightly sweet, quite different from the smell of bread itself, but recognizably its ancestor. This flour once sifted through cloth to remove the coarsest bits of bran, depending on how fine a product the household wanted or could afford, would finally become the raw material for everything we discussed earlier tonight: the overnight leaven, the long patient rise, the journey through the village streets to the waiting communal oven. It's a remarkably long journey, isn't it, from a swaying field of golden wheat, through the rhythmic beating of flails and the patient waiting for a good winnowing wind, through the grinding stones of the mill, and finally into a baker's trough, before it ever becomes the warm, familiar thing we've spent this whole evening imagining. And every single person along the way, the farmer, the thresher, the miller, the baker, each contributed some small essential piece of expertise, passed down through generations, that made the whole system work. Let's rest here a moment, letting the sound of that mill fade quietly into the background, before we turn to something a little more personal and human: the small rituals, sayings, and superstitions that grew up around bread itself, the kind of quiet beliefs that shaped how people treated a loaf even after it had already made its long journey home. Superstition, ritual, and the sacredness of a loaf. I want to slow down again here and talk about something a little more intimate than economics or regulation: the quiet beliefs and small rituals that surrounded bread in ordinary households, the kind of half-remembered customs that got passed from a mother to a daughter without anyone quite explaining why, simply because that was how it had always been done. Bread, across medieval Europe, carried a weight of meaning far beyond simple nutrition. Partly this grew from its association with Christian ritual, the bread of communion representing something sacred at the very center of religious life, but partly it grew from something older and more instinctive, a recognition, even among people who couldn't have explained it in these terms, that bread represented survival itself, the thin margin between a full stomach and a hungry one, and anything that important tends to accumulate customs and careful handling around it. I want you to imagine a particular small habit, common across many regions and long remembered even centuries later, of marking the sign of the cross into the top of a loaf before cutting into it, a quiet, almost automatic gesture of gratitude or blessing before the bread was actually eaten. This wasn't necessarily a formal religious act performed with great ceremony. It was often simply woven into the motion of preparing a meal, the way you might murmur thanks without really thinking about the words. There was also, across many households, a real discomfort with cutting a loaf upside down, a superstition that appears in various forms across different regions, sometimes connected to older beliefs about respecting bread's sacred nature, sometimes explained more practically as simply bad manners, a way of showing carelessness toward something that represented so much labor and dependence. Whatever its precise origin, the loaf in most households always sat crust side up on the table, a small, consistent orientation maintained without much thought, the way we might automatically set a table a certain way today without remembering exactly why that particular arrangement became standard. I want you to imagine, too, the particular unease many households felt around dropped bread. In various regional folk traditions, dropping a piece of bread on the floor called for a small corrective gesture, picking it up quickly, sometimes kissing it before setting it back on the table, a way of apologizing, in a sense, to something considered too important and too precious to treat carelessly, even by accident. Waste, again, sits at the root of so many of these small customs, a practical anxiety about scarcity dressed up in the more comfortable language of superstition and ritual. Bread also played a role in various life events beyond the ordinary daily meal. Wedding customs across many parts of medieval Europe involved bread in some form, sometimes a special loaf baked specifically for the occasion, richer than everyday bread if the household could manage it, sometimes broken over the heads of the bride and groom in a gesture meant to invoke fertility and abundance for the couple's future household, a custom that some historians trace forward into much later wedding traditions still practiced in various forms today. At funerals, too, bread frequently appeared, sometimes distributed to mourners as an act of charity, sometimes baked specifically as part of the funeral feast, called in various regions a burial cake or funeral bread, meant to sustain a grieving family and community through the difficult days surrounding a death, a practical kindness wrapped in the comfort of familiar ritual, much the way we might bring a casserole to a grieving neighbor today, without necessarily thinking of it as anything more than simple. Practical care, even though it carries centuries of similar gestures behind it. I want you to imagine, for a moment, a household experiencing exactly this kind of loss, neighbors arriving quietly at the door, each one carrying a loaf of bread, wordlessly offering the one thing they knew for certain the grieving family would need in the difficult days ahead, when cooking for themselves might understandably feel like too much to manage. There's something deeply comforting in imagining that, isn't there, a whole community's grief and care expressed through something as simple and universal as bread, passed hand to hand, door to door, need to need. Bread also carried protective associations in various folk traditions, sometimes kept in a pocket or carried on a journey as a kind of ward against misfortune, sometimes left as a small offering at the threshold of a new home, or given to a child before a difficult journey, a quiet blessing folded into something practical and familiar, rather than requiring any grander ceremony. I find these small, half-remembered customs some of the most touching parts of this whole story, honestly, because they reveal something universal about how people relate to the things that keep them alive. We don't simply eat bread in this world or in our own. We wrap it in meaning, in gesture, in small rituals of care and gratitude, whether we fully understand where those rituals came from or not. The next time you happen to notice yourself doing something small and automatic around food in your own kitchen, saying a quiet word of thanks, perhaps, or simply feeling a small twinge of guilt at wasting something, you might be touching, without realizing it, the same instinct that shaped so much of what we've discussed tonight. Let's rest here a while, letting these quiet customs settle, before we widen our view once more, and travel a little further afield, beyond the specific traditions of England and northern France that have anchored much of tonight's story, to see how bread making varied across the wider expanse of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean world. Bread across different lands, I want to take you traveling now, gently, away from any single village or region, and across the wider map of medieval Europe and the lands surrounding the Mediterranean, because bread, as central as it was almost everywhere, took on remarkably different shapes, textures, and traditions depending on climate, available grain, and centuries of local custom. Let's begin in the warmer regions around the Mediterranean, in medieval Italy and the lands of southern France, where wheat grew more readily than in the colder, wetter regions further north, and where the tradition of leavened, wheat-based bread reached particularly refined heights. Italian bread traditions during this period, particularly in wealthier city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, developed distinct regional characters, some using olive oil worked into the dough itself, a practice less common further north where olive oil simply wasn't as readily available, producing a softer, richer crumb than the plainer water and flour breads more typical elsewhere. I want you to imagine a baker in medieval Florence, working in a bustling city that had grown wealthy through trade and banking, his bakehouse perhaps considerably busier than a small village oven, serving a denser urban population with a wider range of tastes and incomes to satisfy. Wealthy Florentine households might enjoy bread enriched not just with fine wheat flour, but occasionally with a bit of sugar or dried fruit for special occasions, ingredients that arrived through the same extensive trade networks that made the city prosperous in the first place, connecting this single loaf of bread to spice routes, stretching all the way to the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Traveling further north and east, into the regions that would become modern Germany, Poland, and the Baltic lands, we find a very different bread tradition taking shape, one built far more heavily around rye rather than wheat. The colder climate and often poorer, sandier soils of these regions favored rye, a hardier grain able to withstand harsher winters and less forgiving growing conditions than wheat required. This gave rise to the dense, dark, deeply flavorful rye breads that remain closely associated with German and Eastern European baking traditions even today. Breads like pumpernickel, whose name and exact origins are debated among historians, but which represents a baking tradition stretching back centuries, built around slow fermentation and long, gentle baking that could take many hours, sometimes even a full day, at low, steady heat. I want you to imagine the particular patience required for this style of bread, quite different from the relatively brisk hour, or so we imagined for Osric's wheat loaves earlier tonight. A baker working with this dense rye dough might need to let the bread sit in a cooling oven for the better part of a day, the bread transforming slowly, deepening in color and flavor through hours of gentle, steady heat, rather than the more vigorous initial baking that lighter wheat breads required. The resulting loaf, dense, dark, almost black in some traditions, and remarkably long-lasting, could keep for weeks without spoiling, an enormously practical advantage in regions where long, harsh winters made frequent baking more difficult. Traveling now to the lands around Scandinavia, where growing seasons were shorter still and grain cultivation faced its own particular challenges, we find bread traditions that leaned even further into practicality and preservation. Flatbread, unleavened or only lightly leavened, cooked quickly on a hot griddle or stone rather than requiring a full oven and the fuel that entailed, became especially important in these colder regions, where wood for fuel might be more precious and harder to gather through long winters, and where the shorter growing season meant grain itself was often scarcer and more precious, better stretched thin across a flat, quickly cooked bread than baked into a thick, fuel-hungry loaf. I want you to imagine a Scandinavian household during a long winter gathered close around a fire, a thin round of flatbread cooking quickly on a heated stone nearby, the whole process taking only minutes rather than the hours we've spent discussing tonight for a proper wheat loaf. This bread, sometimes stored dried and hard for months at a time, called knekkebrød in some Scandinavian traditions, a name that survives into the crisp bread still popular in the region today, represents a different but equally thoughtful solution to the same basic problem we've been exploring all evening: how to turn scarce grain into something that could reliably feed a family through hard, cold months. And finally, let's glance briefly toward the eastern edges of the medieval world, toward the Byzantine Empire and the regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, where bread traditions absorbed influences from an even wider network of trade and cultural exchange, connecting to older Roman baking traditions on one side and to the broader culinary world of the Middle East on the other. Byzantine bakers, working in a highly urbanized society with a long tradition of state involvement in grain supply stretching back to Roman times, when the city of Constantinople maintained elaborate systems for ensuring its enormous population received adequate bread, developed particularly refined urban baking traditions, distinct guilds and regulations governing the trade in ways that echo, and in some cases directly influenced, the assize system we discussed earlier in the English context. I want you to sit with this wide map for a moment, this whole continent and beyond, each region solving the same fundamental human problem, turning grain into sustaining, storable food in ways shaped by their particular climate, their particular grain, their particular fuel sources and cultural traditions, and yet all of them in their own way, echoing the same basic rhythm we explored so closely in that first small village bakehouse at the very start of tonight's story. The pre-dawn fire, the patient rise, the careful, hard-won knowledge passed down through generations of hands working the same dough their mothers and grandmothers once worked before them. Let's rest here a while, letting this wide journey across medieval Europe settle quietly, before we return closer to home, gently, to the particular experience of the medieval baker as a tradesman, and the guilds that eventually grew up around this ancient and essential craft. The Bakers' Guild. I want to bring you back now into the town, and specifically into the particular world of the professional baker, someone like Osric, but living now in a busier medieval city rather than a small rural village, because as towns grew larger through the later medieval centuries, the craft of baking became increasingly organized, increasingly professional, and increasingly governed by its own particular institutions, the Bakers' Guild. Guilds, in general, were organizations that grew up around nearly every skilled trade in medieval towns, from weavers to carpenters to goldsmiths, and bakers were no exception. These organizations served several purposes at once, protecting the interests of established bakers within a town by limiting how many new bakeries could open and compete for the same customers, maintaining certain standards of quality and training through a formal system of apprenticeship, and often taking on a role in local governance and regulation, working alongside or sometimes overlapping with the same civic authorities responsible for enforcing the assize of bread we discussed earlier. I want you to imagine a young boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, being brought by his family to the workshop of an established master baker, to begin an apprenticeship that might last 7 years or longer, depending on the particular guild's rules and the region. This wasn't simply a job. It was closer to an entire way of life. The boy would typically live within the master's household, working long hours in exchange for room, board, and gradually accumulating skill and knowledge, with the understanding that at the end of his training, having proven his competence to the satisfaction of the guild, he might himself become a recognized baker, eventually perhaps a master with his own apprentices in turn. The early years of this apprenticeship would likely involve the least glamorous work imaginable: fetching water, tending fires, cleaning the bakehouse, running errands, before gradually being trusted with more skilled tasks, learning to judge the readiness of dough by feel and smell, learning to read the heat of the oven by eye, learning the delicate timing that separated a properly baked loaf from a burnt or undercooked one. This kind of knowledge, we should remember, existed almost entirely outside of written instruction. There were no recipe books with precise measurements and temperatures the way we're accustomed to today. Everything was passed down through direct observation and physical practice. A young apprentice standing beside his master morning after morning, year after year, gradually absorbing knowledge that couldn't easily be written down at all, only demonstrated and repeated until it became instinct. And I want you to imagine the particular quality of this kind of learning, so different from how most of us learn things today, sitting with books or screens in front of us. This was knowledge held entirely in the body, in the hands, in years of accumulated small sensory judgments, the exact give of properly kneaded dough under the palm, the particular smell that meant a loaf needed only a few more minutes, the sound the oven walls made as they cooled that told an experienced baker precisely how much longer his heat would hold. Once an apprentice completed his training, in many guild systems he would need to produce what was called a masterpiece, a demonstration loaf or set of baked goods presented to established guild members for judgment, proving his skill was sufficient to be recognized as a full member of the trade himself. Only after this recognition could he open his own bakehouse, take on his own apprentices, and fully participate in the professional and social life of the guild, which often included its own particular traditions, feast days honoring a patron saint associated with bakers, mutual aid arrangements to support guild members and their families through illness or hardship, and a genuine sense of shared identity and pride in the craft. Guild membership also came with real responsibilities and real risks. Because guilds regulated their own trade partly in cooperation with and partly in tension with civic authorities, bakers found themselves subject to considerable scrutiny, and the penalties we discussed earlier for underweight or fraudulent bread fell most heavily on professional urban bakers operating under this guild system, precisely because their trade was so visible, so essential, and so closely watched by both their fellow guild members and the wider town government. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the particular pride a master baker might feel, having spent years working his way up from that first day as a frightened young apprentice, fetching water and tending fires, to finally standing as a recognized master of his craft, perhaps eventually serving in some official capacity within the guild itself, respected by his neighbors, trusted by his customers, his household mark on a loaf of bread recognized and valued across his town. There's a particular satisfaction in mastery earned slowly, through years of repetitive, patient practice, isn't there? A satisfaction that feels somehow different, perhaps deeper, than skills acquired quickly. I wonder if you've ever felt something like that yourself, in whatever craft or skill you've spent years slowly refining in your own life. Let's rest here a while, in the quiet satisfaction of that hard-won mastery, before we turn our attention to the changing seasons, and how the whole rhythm of bread making we've explored tonight shifted and adjusted, as the year turned from summer through harvest and into the long, cold stretch of winter. Bred through the turning seasons, I want to slow down again now and think about time in a different way, not the single day we've spent so much of tonight following, from Osric's pre-dawn fire through to the Loaves finally coming home, but the whole turning wheel of the year, because bread making, like almost everything else in medieval life, was deeply shaped by the changing seasons. Let's begin in late summer, the season of harvest we touched on earlier, when the whole rhythm of village life reoriented itself around bringing in the grain before weather could damage it. This was in many ways the most demanding season of the entire year, requiring long days of physical labor from nearly everyone in the community, and bread itself, during harvest time, often took on a particular practical role. Sturdy, portable loaves carried out to the fields to sustain workers through long days of cutting and gathering grain under the late summer sun. I want you to imagine a harvest meal eaten not at a table indoors, but out in the field itself, workers pausing briefly in the shade of a hedgerow or a solitary tree, tearing into bread carried out from the village that morning, perhaps alongside a bit of cheese, an onion, a skin of thin ale to wash it down. A simple, practical meal meant to refuel tired bodies quickly before returning to the demanding work of the harvest. As autumn settled in, following the harvest, this was traditionally when the year's grain was threshed, winnowed, and finally milled into the flour that would need to last through the coming winter and into the following spring, before the next harvest could replenish supplies. Households paid careful attention to how this grain was stored, keeping it dry, protected from rodents and damp, because a poorly stored grain supply, susceptible to mold or spoilage, could threaten a family's food security through the entire following. Winter itself brought its own particular rhythm to bread making. The pre-dawn darkness we imagined at the very start of tonight's story stretched longest during these months, meaning Osric and bakers like him faced their coldest, darkest mornings tending the bakehouse fire during precisely this season, when the warmth of that oven, radiating gently through the stone walls of the bakehouse, would have offered a genuine, welcome refuge from the bitter cold outside, a place where villagers bringing their dough might linger a little longer than strictly necessary, warming themselves by the glow of the oven while they waited. I want you to imagine this particular scene, a small bakehouse on a winter morning, snow perhaps dusting the ground outside, breath visible in clouds with every exhale, and inside a small gathering of neighbors, not rushing away the moment their business with the baker was concluded, but lingering a while in the warmth, exchanging news, sharing a bit of gossip, perhaps a story or two, the bakehouse serving not just its practical function but also quietly as a genuine gathering place for the community during the hardest, coldest stretch of the year, in the same way a shared fire has drawn people together to talk and rest since long before recorded history began. Winter also meant that fuel for the oven's fire became a more precious, carefully managed resource, wood gathered and stored through the milder months now needing to be rationed carefully to last through the cold season, and this sometimes meant bakehouses operated on a somewhat reduced schedule during the depths of winter, baking perhaps slightly less frequently, households stretching their existing bread supply a little further between visits to the communal oven, out of simple practical necessity. As spring finally arrived, and the days lengthened again, bread making could return to its more regular rhythm, though spring itself brought its own particular anxieties, as households watched their winter grain stores dwindle, hoping earnestly that the supply would last until the new harvest, still months away, could replenish them. This was often, historically, the leanest time of year for many medieval households, sometimes called the hunger gap in various later agricultural traditions, a period when the previous year's stores ran low, but the new harvest remained too far off to help, and bread during this season might grow noticeably smaller, or be stretched with whatever substitute ingredients a household had managed to preserve or forage. I want you to imagine, then, the particular relief that arrived with the first bread baked from the new harvest's grain each year, a genuine, deeply felt milestone in the rhythm of village life, marking the successful completion of another full turn of the agricultural year. Another cycle of scarcity survived, another winter safely behind them. Various harvest festivals and celebrations across medieval Europe, some connected to Christian holidays like Lammas, a name deriving from Loaf Mass, celebrated in early August and specifically involving bread baked from the season's first ripe grain, marked this moment with genuine communal celebration, a whole village gathering to share in the relief and gratitude of having once again successfully turned the earth's slow, patient gift of grain into the bread that would sustain them through another year. I find something quietly moving in imagining this whole yearly cycle, don't you? The way an entire community's rhythm of anxiety and relief, scarcity and abundance, wove itself so completely around this single, humble food. We tend to think of bread today as something almost too ordinary to notice, sitting quietly on a shelf at the store, always available, never truly scarce. But for the people we've been imagining together tonight, bread carried within it the whole story of the turning year, the harvest's success or failure, the long patient waiting through winter, the quiet, deeply felt relief of a new season's first loaf. Let's rest here a while longer in that seasonal rhythm before we turn, gently, toward the end of tonight's journey, and gather together everything we've learned about this remarkable, ordinary food that shaped so much of daily life across the medieval world. Women, households, and the daily bread. I want to return now, gently, to something we touched on earlier but haven't fully explored, the particular role women played in the daily reality of bread making. Because while we've spent time with Osric at his communal oven, so much of the actual labor behind bread, the parts that happened before any dough ever reached the bakehouse at all, rested most often in the hands of women. Picture once more Ali's from earlier in our story, and consider just how much of her daily and weekly labor revolved around this single food. Beyond the actual kneading and management of the leaven we described earlier, women in most medieval households bore responsibility for an entire constellation of related tasks, tending the household grain stores, monitoring for damp or pests that might spoil supplies, deciding how finely to sift flour depending on what the household could spare, managing the delicate, sometimes finicky leaven itself day to day, feeding it small amounts of flour and water between baking days to keep it alive and active, much the way a sourdough enthusiast today might carefully maintain a starter culture on their kitchen counter, except with considerably higher stakes if the leaven died and needed to be started over from scratch or borrowed in an emergency from a generous neighbor. So I want you to imagine the particular knowledge Alice carried in her hands and her nose, knowledge she likely never wrote down anywhere, because she may never have learned to write at all, in a period when literacy remained rare, particularly among women outside of wealthy or religious households. And yet the sophistication of what she knew, the subtle signs that told her when dough had risen enough, the precise texture that meant flour had been milled finely enough for a special occasion versus coarsely enough for an ordinary day, the seasonal adjustments needed as the ambient temperature of her home shifted from summer to winter, affecting how quickly her leaven worked, represents a genuine, sophisticated expertise. Simply one carried entirely through practice and memory, rather than through the written record that historians usually rely upon. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means so much of the real, technical knowledge behind medieval bread making has come down to us today only indirectly, inferred from archaeological remains, from occasional mentions in other kinds of documents, from the few surviving cookery texts written mostly for wealthier households, rather than from any direct record of the countless women like Ali's who quietly held and passed down this expertise, generation after generation, mother to daughter, without ever imagining that history might one day wonder about their work at all. I want you to imagine, too, the particular rhythm of a household where bread making needed to be balanced against every other demand on a woman's time and energy, tending children, managing livestock, spinning wool or thread, mending clothing, helping with whatever seasonal agricultural work needed extra hands, and doing all of this while also managing the multi-day process we described earlier, tending a leaven, planning the timing of a rise around the household's other needs, and coordinating with neighbors and the communal bakehouse schedule. This wasn't drudgery exactly, though the labor was certainly real and often physically demanding. It was simply the deeply woven fabric of ordinary daily life, the kind of competent, quiet expertise that made a household function, the same kind of expertise, in a sense, that keeps any household functioning today, even if the specific tasks look entirely different now. I wonder if you've ever thought about the particular skills, quiet and often unglamorous, that someone in your own life holds and exercises every day, skills so woven into ordinary routine that they rarely get acknowledged as the genuine expertise they are. Children, too, played their part in this household economy of bread, even from a fairly young age. A small child might be given simple, manageable tasks, fetching water for the kneading trough, watching over a younger sibling while their mother's hands were occupied, running the short errand of carrying dough to the bakehouse alongside an older sibling or parent, gradually absorbing, simply through repeated exposure and small participation, the same knowledge that would eventually become their own responsibility as they grew older, particularly for daughters, who would most likely find themselves managing exactly this same set of tasks within their own households one day. I want you to imagine a small child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, standing on a low stool beside the kneading trough, hands too small yet to do much real work, but watching intently, occasionally allowed to press a small ball of dough between her own palms in careful imitation of her mother's much larger, more practiced motions. The very beginning of a lifetime's slow accumulation of the same quiet expertise we've spent so much of tonight admiring. Let's rest here a moment in that image of a small child learning slowly at her mother's side, before we widen our view one final time and consider the physical structures themselves, the ovens and bakehouses that varied so much in their construction depending on region, wealth, and available materials, because these humble buildings, easy to overlook, shaped so much of what we've discussed tonight. The shape of the oven itself. I want to spend some time now looking closely at the ovens themselves, the physical structures that made everything we've discussed tonight possible, because their construction, surprisingly varied across the medieval world, reveals a great deal about local resources, local wealth, and the accumulated practical wisdom of generations of builders solving the same basic problem: how to create and hold intense heat safely and efficiently. The most common design across much of medieval Europe was what's sometimes called a beehive oven, named for its shape, a low, rounded dome, somewhat resembling an old-fashioned woven beehive, built from brick, stone, or a combination of materials depending on what was locally available and affordable. This shape wasn't chosen arbitrarily. The dome's curved interior surface was specifically well suited to reflecting and retaining heat evenly throughout the enclosed space, distributing warmth more consistently around a batch of loaves than a simple flat-walled chamber might manage. I want you to imagine the construction of one of these ovens, a genuinely significant undertaking requiring real skill and no small expense. The floor of the oven, the surface loaves would eventually rest directly upon, needed to be built from a material capable of withstanding repeated, intense heating without cracking, often flat stones or specially fired bricks, carefully fitted together as smoothly as possible, since any significant gaps or unevenness could create trouble spots where bread might stick, burn, or bake unevenly. Above this floor, the dome itself rose in careful courses of brick or stone, sometimes reinforced with a mixture of clay and straw packed around the exterior, both for additional insulation and structural stability. Building an oven correctly required real expertise, and a poorly built oven, one that cracked under the stress of repeated heating and cooling, or that failed to hold heat efficiently, represented a genuinely significant loss for whichever household, manor, or village had invested in its construction. This is part of why communal ovens made such practical sense in many villages, spreading the considerable cost and expertise required for proper construction across an entire community, rather than expecting every individual household to bear that expense alone. Wealthier households and manors, however, particularly by the later medieval centuries, increasingly built their own private ovens, a mark of status in its own right, freeing a household from dependence on a shared communal schedule, and from whatever fees or portions of the loaf a lord's communal oven might require in exchange for its use. I want you to imagine the particular convenience this represented, a household able to bake exactly when it chose, rather than working around the schedule and demands of an entire village sharing a single oven. In regions with abundant good clay, but scarcer or more expensive stone and brick, oven construction sometimes took a somewhat different, simpler form, essentially a large clay dome built directly on the ground or on a raised earthen platform, fired initially through a slow, careful process before ever being used for actual baking, in order to harden the clay itself into something durable enough to withstand the repeated heat cycles of regular use. These clay ovens, while perhaps less durable over the very long term compared to a well-built brick or stone structure, required considerably less upfront investment, making them accessible to poorer households or smaller settlements that couldn't easily manage the greater expense of a proper masonry oven. I want you to imagine, too, the particular danger that came with all of this fire in a world built so heavily from wood and thatch. Bakehouses, given how much fire they required and how frequently that fire needed tending, represented a genuine fire risk to any settlement, and this is part of why many villages and towns deliberately positioned their communal ovens somewhat apart from the densest cluster of residential buildings, sometimes near a water source for practical safety reasons, sometimes simply on the edge of the settlement where a fire, should the worst happen, might be contained before it could spread to homes where families slept. Some larger towns eventually developed formal regulations specifically governing where bakehouses could be built, how far from neighboring structures, what materials needed to line chimneys and flues, precursors, in a sense, to the fire codes we take for granted in construction today, born from hard, sometimes tragic experience, as towns learned, occasionally through devastating fires, just how much care this essential but genuinely dangerous heat required. I want you to sit for a moment with the particular vulnerability and trust involved in this whole system, an entire village depending, every single day, on a large, carefully managed fire, tended usually by one person, requiring real skill to manage safely, and requiring the whole community's collective trust that this arrangement, repeated morning after morning for generations, would continue working the way it always had. There's something almost profound in that quiet, daily trust, isn't there, so easy to overlook, so essential to how this entire world functioned. Let's rest here a while, letting the warm glow of that oven settle in your mind one more time, before we bring tonight's long, slow journey to its gentle close, gathering together everything we've walked through this evening. Bread on the road, I want to take you somewhere slightly different now, away from the settled rhythm of village and town we've spent most of tonight exploring, and out onto the road itself, because bread also played a particular practical role for the many travelers, pilgrims, merchants, and wandering laborers who moved across the medieval landscape, often for weeks or months at a time, far from any household's kneading trough or any village's familiar communal oven. Picture for a moment a group of pilgrims setting out on a journey, perhaps toward a distant shrine, following the network of pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe, some heading toward Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, others toward Canterbury or Rome or Jerusalem itself for the most ambitious and well-resourced travelers. These journeys could stretch across weeks or months, and travelers needed food that could survive the road, resist spoiling, and provide real, sustaining nourishment without requiring elaborate preparation along the way. Twice-baked bread, a category that includes what eventually became known in various forms as biscuit, a word deriving from the French for twice cooked, served exactly this purpose. Ordinary bread, baked once as usual, would then be sliced and returned to a cooling oven for a second, longer baking at lower heat, driving out nearly all remaining moisture and producing a bread hard and dry enough to resist mold and spoilage for remarkably long periods, sometimes many months, provided it was kept reasonably dry along the way. I want you to imagine the particular experience of eating this bread on the road, quite different from the warm, fresh loaves we imagined earlier tonight coming straight from Osric's communal oven. This twice-baked bread would be genuinely hard, sometimes requiring softening in water, wine, or broth before it could be comfortably eaten, particularly for travelers whose teeth might already be worn or damaged from a lifetime of coarse, gritty medieval flour. Sailors, too, depended heavily on this same style of long-lasting bread for extended sea voyages, when fresh baking was simply impossible for weeks or months at a stretch, giving rise to what English sailors eventually came to call ship's biscuit or hardtack, a food that persisted in various forms well beyond the medieval period itself, remaining a staple of naval provisioning for centuries afterward. Merchants traveling the extensive medieval trade routes connecting distant markets, sometimes stretching from England through France and Italy, sometimes further still into the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, similarly relied on this durable, portable bread to sustain themselves across journeys that might last many weeks, particularly before reaching towns large enough to offer reliable fresh provisions along the way. I want you to imagine, too, the experience of arriving, finally, after weeks of subsisting on this hard, twice-baked bread, into a town where fresh bread was once again available, warm and soft from a proper communal oven. There's something worth sitting with in that particular relief, Isn't there the way simple, ordinary comforts, easy to take entirely for granted in daily life, become genuinely precious after a period of doing without them? I wonder if you've ever experienced something similar yourself, perhaps returning home after a long trip away, and felt a small, disproportionate joy at something as simple as your own bed, or a home-cooked meal made just the way you like it. Inns and taverns along these well-traveled routes developed their own particular relationship with bread, often serving as informal way stations, where a traveler might purchase a fresh loaf to supplement whatever hardened provisions remained in their pack, or where an innkeeper's own household bread, made using the same basic methods we've explored throughout tonight's story, might be offered alongside a warm meal and a night's rest. Historical records from various pilgrimage routes mention the particular reputations certain towns or inns developed for the quality of their bread, travelers passing along word-of-mouth recommendations to one another, much the way we might recommend a favorite restaurant or bakery to a friend today, a small human continuity stretching easily across the centuries between us. Let's rest here a while, imagining that weary traveler finally settling down for the night with a fresh, warm loaf after weeks on hard, dusty roads, before we turn, gently, toward gathering together everything we've explored this evening, and bringing tonight's long, slow journey to its quiet close. An ordinary day, revisited, I want to bring you back now, one more time, to that same small village bakehouse we began this whole journey inside, and walk through an ordinary baking day once more, but this time with everything we've learned in the hours since layered quietly underneath it, so that even the simplest, smallest details carry a little more weight than they did at the very beginning of tonight's story. It is still dark. Osric is still awake before anyone else, kneeling at the low mouth of his oven, stirring yesterday's embers back to life. But now you know what that stone has been through, the careful decisions about wood and heat that took him years to fully master, the trust an entire village places in his particular skill every single morning. You know, too, about the guild that likely trained him, the years he spent as a nervous young apprentice fetching water and tending fires before he ever touched a proper batch of dough himself. Across the village, doors are beginning to open. Alize steps out into the cold morning air, her dough wrapped carefully in cloth, marked with her family's particular symbol, the same mark her mother used before her and her mother's mother before that. You know now about the leaven she's tended so carefully through the night, feeding it, keeping it warm, trusting a process she couldn't see or fully explain, but that she'd learned, through years of quiet practice, to trust completely. You know, too, about the particular weight bread carries in her household's daily life, providing the overwhelming majority of the calories that will sustain her family through whatever work the day demands of them. As she walks toward the bakehouse, joining her neighbors along the same familiar path, you know now about the wider world this simple morning ritual connects to, the fields where this same grain grew months earlier, the flails beating rhythmically against threshed stalks, the patient waiting for a good winnowing wind, the mill's great turning stones grinding grain into flour just days or weeks before. You know about the assize laws quietly shaping the size and price of the loaves she'll collect later this morning, and about the baker's dozen, a small, practical kindness born from very reasonable fear of harsh punishment. At the bakehouse, as Osric receives loaf after loaf, sorting them by their careful individual marks, you know now about the different breads represented in that single morning's baking, the coarse, dark rye or maslin loaves belonging to most ordinary households, and perhaps, if this village happens to sit near a manor, the finer, paler wheat loaf destined for a lord's own table, prepared with entirely different flour, entirely different expectations. As the loaves finally emerge, hours later, transformed by heat into something warm and fragrant, you know now about everything this simple moment represents. An entire community's patient trust in fire and time and inherited knowledge. A whole year's turning seasons folded into this one ordinary morning, harvest and thrashing and milling, and the long, quiet waiting through winter, all arriving finally. At this single warm loaf now resting in Ali's hands, as she carries it back home through streets filled with that same unmistakable, comforting smell. I want you to sit with this fuller picture for a moment, this ordinary morning we've now walked through twice, once with fresh eyes at the very beginning of tonight's story, and once more now carrying everything we've learned in between. Doesn't it feel different now, richer somehow, even though nothing about the actual events themselves has changed at all? That's often how history works, I think. The closer you look at even the most ordinary, overlooked corners of daily life, the more genuine depth and meaning you find quietly waiting there, hidden in plain sight the whole time, in something as simple and universal as a loaf of bread. Let's rest here a while in this fuller, richer version of that same quiet morning, before we bring tonight's long journey to its gentle close. What remained the same as we come toward the end of tonight's long, slow journey together? I want to spend a few final quiet minutes thinking about what actually endured from this world we've spent the evening exploring. What threads connect that small medieval bakehouse, warm and smoky in the pre-dawn dark, to your own kitchen tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from. Bread in some form remains genuinely universal across nearly every culture that has ever cultivated grain, and the fundamental chemistry we discussed earlier tonight, wild yeast and bacteria slowly transforming flour and water into something risen and flavorful, remains essentially unchanged, whether it happens in a medieval kneading trough or in a stand mixer on a modern kitchen counter. The sourdough culture so many people have taken up cultivating in more recent years, feeding a jar of flour and water faithfully day after day, watching it bubble and rise, is in its essential biology doing exactly what Ali's carefully tended leaven was doing 8 centuries ago, even if she never could have explained the science behind it the way we can today. The particular patience bread requires, too, has remained remarkably constant across the centuries. You cannot rush a proper rise, not really, not without sacrificing something in flavor and texture that time alone provides. even with modern instant yeasts capable of working considerably faster than the wild cultures Ali's relied upon. The best bread, by most accounts, still benefits from exactly the kind of slow, patient fermentation that medieval bakers had no choice but to practice, simply because that was the only method available to them. There's something worth appreciating in that continuity, isn't there? A reminder that some processes simply cannot be meaningfully hurried, no matter how much technology and convenience have changed everything around them. The communal element of bread making, too, though largely vanished from most of our own daily lives, echoes still in smaller ways. The local bakery some of us still visit regularly, greeted by name, our particular preferences remembered, in a small echo of the familiar trust Ali's placed in Osric each morning. The occasional home baker sharing a loaf with a neighbor or bringing bread to a grieving family carries forward, whether consciously or not, the same instinct that shaped so many of the customs we explored earlier tonight. And perhaps most simply of all, the basic comfort bread provides, warm, familiar, deeply nourishing in a way that goes beyond simple calories, remains exactly what it always was. I imagine if we could somehow bring Ali's forward through the centuries and set a warm, fresh loaf in front of her today, whatever else about our world might bewilder or overwhelm her, this one thing, at least, would feel immediately, comfortingly familiar. The smell alone would tell her everything she needed to know. I want you to think for just a moment about your own relationship with bread, whatever that might look like. A loaf from your local grocery store, something you've baked yourself, a memory of bread shared at some particular meal or occasion in your own life. However far removed our own daily lives might feel from the world we've spent tonight exploring, this one thread, warm, humble, endlessly patient, connects us still to that small medieval bakehouse, and to Osric and Ali's, and to countless others like them, whose names never made it into any history book, but whose quiet, careful, everyday labor, repeated morning after morning for centuries, fed the whole slow unfolding of the medieval world. Thank you for spending this long, quiet evening with me, walking together through fields and mills and bakehouses, through village streets thick with the smell of fresh bread, through famine years and feast days both. I hope wherever you are right now, you're feeling that same warm, settled comfort we've been exploring all this time, and that sleep is finding you gently, the way a good, patient rise finds its own quiet way to fullness, in its own unhurried time. Rest well, friend. We'll walk through another quiet corner of history together again soon.